The howling wind that February night of 1933 carried more than just snow and ice. It brought a secret that would haunt our family for 90 years. I was 12 then, huddled by our cabin's wood stove in the remote mining settlement of Coldbrook, Alaska, listening to my father sharpen his pickaxe while my mother mended torn mittens by candlelight. The blizzard outside had been raging for 3 days straight, trapping our small community of 47 souls in a world of white fury that seemed determined to erase us from existence. Little did I know that within hours our lives would change forever when the storm delivered something, or someone, that would challenge everything I thought I knew about family, survival, and the secrets buried beneath Alaska's unforgiving ice. What I'm about to tell you will shake you to your very core, because some mysteries are so deep that even time itself struggles to uncover their truth. Comment, frostbitten below, and in the next few minutes I'll reveal the discovery that my family kept hidden for almost a century. The sound started as a whisper beneath the storm's roar, a rhythmic thumping against our cabin door that made my father's weathered hands freeze mid-stroke on his blade. My mother's needle stopped its patient dance through the wool, and we all held our breath as the thumping grew more desperate, more human. "Sarah, keep the boy back," my father commanded, his voice carrying that edge I'd learned to recognize when danger lurked beyond our walls. He moved toward the heavy oak door with the same careful steps he used when approaching unstable mine shafts, every muscle tense with anticipation. The wind screamed like a banshee as he lifted the wooden latch, and what stumbled through that doorway would transform our understanding of love, loss, and the lengths people will go to protect the innocent. But that frozen figure collapsing onto our floor was just the beginning of a mystery that would outlive us all. Through the swirling snow and bitter cold, a small form crumpled at my father's feet, a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His lips blue as glacier ice and his tiny fingers curled like frozen claws. His clothes were strange, not the rough wool and leather we wore in Coldbrook, but fine fabric that spoke of wealth from somewhere far beyond our isolated world. Frost had crystallized in his dark hair, and his breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that made my mother rush forward with blankets and hot water. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her gentle hands already working to save this mysterious child, who'd appeared from nowhere in the heart of Alaska's deadliest storm. My father barred the door against the wind while I watched this stranger's chest rise and fall with the fragile rhythm of life barely holding on. The questions burning in my mind: who was he? Where had he come from? And how had he survived in that killing cold? Would haunt me for decades. As my mother worked to warm the boy's frozen limbs, I noticed something that made my blood run colder than the air outside. He wore a gold locket around his neck, its surface engraved with symbols I'd never seen before. His small hands clutched a leather pouch so tightly that even unconsciousness couldn't make him release it. And when my father gently pried it open, we found things that made no sense. A photograph of people in fine city clothes, a letter written in a language none of us could read, and most puzzling of all, a train ticket dated just 2 weeks prior from Seattle to Nome. But Nome was 300 miles away across some of the most treacherous terrain in Alaska, and no child could have survived such a journey alone, especially not in this weather. My father's eyes met my mother's over the boy's still form, and I saw something pass between them, a silent understanding that this child's arrival would bring consequences none of us were prepared for. For 3 days, the boy drifted between life and death while the blizzard raged on, trapping us all in a world where time seemed suspended and reality felt as fragile as ice over rushing water. My mother barely left his side, spooning warm broth between his cracked lips and whispering prayers that seemed to echo off our cabin walls like desperate pleas to a God who might have forgotten about our tiny corner of the world. When his fever finally broke on the 4th morning, his eyes opened to reveal a startling blue that reminded me of the deep ice in the abandoned mine shafts, beautiful but somehow hollow, as if the cold had frozen more than just his body. "What's your name, son?" my father asked gently, but the boy only stared at us with those haunting eyes, his mouth working soundlessly as if the words were trapped somewhere beyond his reach. Something about his silence felt different from simple fear or confusion. It felt like a door that had been locked from the inside, protecting secrets that might be too dangerous to speak aloud. When spring finally arrived and the boy still couldn't or wouldn't tell us his name, my parents made a decision that would echo through generations. They would raise him as their own, calling him Thomas after my father's brother who'd died in a mine collapse the year before. The official story became that Thomas was a distant cousin sent to live with us after his parents died in Seattle, a lie so carefully constructed that even the territorial officials who occasionally visited our settlement never questioned it. But I saw the way my mother would stare at that locket when she thought no one was watching, her fingers tracing those strange symbols as if they might unlock the mystery of our new brother's past. I noticed how my father would sometimes pause in his work, his gaze distant and troubled, as if he was wrestling with knowledge too heavy for even his strong shoulders to bear. 90 years have passed since that night, and now as I lay dying in this hospital bed, I finally understand that some secrets are meant to be buried in the ice, but others are meant to rise again when the world is ready for their truth. Living with Thomas was like sharing our home with a ghost who cast a shadow. He was there, breathing and growing stronger each day, but something essential about him remained forever beyond our reach. The boy learned our routines quickly enough, helping my mother with the washing and following my father to the mine entrance each morning. But he moved through our world with the careful precision of someone who understood that one wrong step might shatter the fragile illusion of belonging. His silence wasn't defiance or stubbornness. It was something deeper, more protective, as if speaking might release memories too dangerous to set free. When other families in Coldbrook visited our cabin, I watched Thomas retreat into himself like a turtle pulling into its shell, his remarkable blue eyes becoming flat and distant. The questions people asked, innocent enough on the surface, seemed to strike him like physical blows, and I began to understand that my new brother carried wounds that went far deeper than frostbite. But the most unsettling thing about Thomas wasn't his silence. It was the way he sometimes stared at the mountains to the east, as if he was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. As spring melted into summer, the differences between Thomas and the rest of us became impossible to ignore, though my parents did their best to pretend everything was normal. He ate his meals with a peculiar formality, holding his fork in ways that spoke of dining rooms rather than mining camp kitchens, and when he thought no one was watching, I caught him tracing letters in the dirt, not the rough alphabet I was learning at our settlement's one-room schoolhouse, but elegant script that flowed like water across the ground. His hands, despite the calluses from helping with chores, remained soft and uncalloused in places where a miner's son should have been rough and scarred. Most telling of all were the nightmares that gripped him during those long summer nights. Not the typical fears of a child lost and found, but complex terrors that made him cry out in what sounded like another language entirely. My mother would rush to comfort him, but even her gentle touch couldn't seem to reach whatever dark place his dreams took him. These weren't the nightmares of someone who'd simply gotten lost in a blizzard. They were the screams of a soul that had witnessed something no child should ever see. The first real crack in Thomas's carefully constructed silence came during the annual Miners' Day celebration in August, when families from 3 neighboring settlements gathered to share food, stories, and precious news from the outside world. Old Pete Mackenzie, who'd been working claims in Alaska since before statehood, was regaling the crowd with tales of his adventures when he mentioned a trading post that had burned down near the Canadian border the previous winter. Thomas, who'd been quietly whittling a piece of wood nearby, suddenly went rigid, his small knife clattering to the ground as his face turned the color of fresh snow. "Burned down complete," Pete continued, unaware of the boy's reaction. "Took 17 souls with it, including some fancy folks from back east who'd gotten stranded there during a blizzard." The piece of wood fell from Thomas's trembling hands, and I saw him mouth a single word, "Mama," before he bolted from the gathering like a spooked caribou. My father found him hours later, huddled behind our cabin and clutching that mysterious leather pouch to his chest, tears freezing on his cheeks in the cool mountain air. When Papa tried to comfort him, Thomas looked up with eyes that held more pain than any child should carry, and for just a moment his careful walls crumbled enough to whisper, "They're all gone, aren't they?" That night, after Thomas had cried himself to sleep, I heard my parents whispering by the dying. Embers of our fire, their voices carrying a weight of understanding that chilled me more than any Arctic wind. "He's not just lost, Samuel," my mother said, her words heavy with sorrow. "He's the only one left." My father's response came slowly, as if each word was being carved from stone. "That trading post Pete mentioned, I heard tell there were wealthy folks trapped there when it caught fire. A family with connections back east who'd been traveling with guides and servants. The implications of what they were saying hit me like a physical blow. Thomas wasn't just some orphaned cousin. He was the sole survivor of a tragedy so complete that it had erased his entire world. "We can't send him back to nothing, Sarah," my father continued. "And we can't tell anyone the truth without destroying what little peace he's found here." Their words painted a picture of loss so profound that I finally understood why Thomas moved through our world like someone afraid that happiness might be snatched away at any moment. But even then, I sensed there were layers to his story that my parents hadn't yet uncovered. Secrets buried deeper than even their gentle probing could reach. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas began to show us glimpses of the person he'd been before that terrible winter night, and what we saw both amazed and troubled us. He could read with a fluency that put our settlement's teacher to shame, devouring every scrap of printed material that found its way to Coldbrook, newspapers months old, torn pages from catalogs, even the technical manuals that came with mining equipment. When I struggled with arithmetic, he helped me with a patience and understanding that suggested formal education far beyond his apparent years, explaining complex problems with the ease of someone who'd been tutored by the finest teachers money could buy. Most remarkably, he could speak fragments of what sounded like French and German, languages as foreign to our rough mining community as the languages of the moon. "Where did you learn all this?" I asked him one crisp October afternoon as he helped me with a particularly difficult geography lesson. His answer came so quietly I almost missed it. "Before the fire," he said, then immediately closed off again, as if he'd revealed too much. But those 3 words opened a door in my understanding, and I began to realize that Thomas wasn't just grieving for lost family. He was mourning an entire way of life that had been consumed by flames and buried under Alaska's indifferent snow. The first snows of our second winter together brought a change in Thomas that both comforted and worried my parents in equal measure. He seemed to accept his place in our family with less of the desperate wariness that had marked his early months with us, laughing at my father's rough jokes and even joining in our evening songs around the fire. But this newfound peace came with a troubling cost. He began to forget details about his life before, or perhaps more accurately, he began to bury them so deeply that even he couldn't reach them anymore. The nightmares that had plagued his summer nights grew less frequent, but so did the flashes of education and refinement that had marked him as different from the rest of us. It was as if he was willingly allowing the wilderness to erase the parts of himself that belonged to his lost world, trading his memories for the chance to truly belong somewhere again. "He's healing," my mother said one evening as we watched him contentedly carve wooden toys by the fire, but I heard the uncertainty in her voice. My father's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes healing looks a lot like forgetting, Sarah, and sometimes that's the only way a soul can survive." But as I watched my adopted brother smile and laugh with the easy joy of any mining camp child, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all complicit in allowing something precious and irreplaceable to slip away into the darkness of Alaska's endless winter nights. By the time Thomas turned 10, or what we guessed was 10, since we'd never known his true age, my father began taking both of us down into the Coldbrook mine shafts, teaching us the dangerous dance between man and mountain that had sustained our community for nearly 2 decades. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels carved into the frozen earth, its walls glittering with veins of gold that promised wealth, but delivered only back-breaking labor and constant peril. Thomas took to the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, his small hands learning to handle pick and shovel with the same precision he'd once applied to his mysterious studies. But there was something about the deep tunnels that affected him differently than it did the rest of us. While I felt the oppressive weight of tons of rock above my head, he seemed to find peace in the darkness, as if the mine's depths offered him a refuge from memories that still haunted the surface world. My father noticed it too, the way Thomas would linger in the tunnels long after the work was done, standing perfectly still in the flickering candlelight, as if he was listening to voices only he could hear. "That boy's got the mountain's respect," Papa told my mother one evening, but his words carried an undertone of concern that made me wonder if Thomas was finding something down there that we should all be afraid of. The first sign that the mine held more than gold came during a routine excavation. in the eastern tunnel, where Thomas had insisted we dig despite my father's reservations about the unstable-looking rock face. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something that rang like metal against stone, and when we cleared away the debris, we found a leather satchel perfectly preserved in the permafrost. Inside were documents that made my father's weathered hands shake as he held them up to our lamplight. Maps of Alaska drawn with surveyor's precision, correspondence bearing the seal of territorial officials, and most disturbing of all, a passenger manifest from a riverboat that had supposedly been lost during a storm 2 years before Thomas arrived. The manifest listed a family named Blackwood, parents, 3 children, and 2 servants, all traveling from Seattle to establish a new trading post near the Canadian border. "Samuel," my mother whispered when we showed her the papers that night. "What if that trading post old Pete mentioned wasn't the first tragedy?" The implications hit us like a physical blow. If Thomas was connected to these documents, then his story was part of a pattern of disappearances and disasters that stretched far beyond a single fire. But the most chilling discovery came when Thomas saw the satchel and immediately backed away from it, his face going white as fresh snow as he whispered words that made my blood freeze. The shadow man said they'd all forgotten about us. As winter deepened and we continued our work in the mine, Thomas's behavior grew increasingly strange, as if the discovery of that satchel had awakened something in him that he'd spent 2 years trying to bury. He would stop suddenly while we worked, his head tilted as if listening to conversations the rest of us couldn't hear, and sometimes I caught him speaking to the darkness in that other language we'd heard in his nightmares. "There are people down here," he told me one afternoon as we cleared debris from a collapsed section, his voice carrying absolute certainty that chilled me to the bone. When I asked him what he meant, he simply pointed deeper into the tunnel system and said, "They're waiting." My father dismissed it as the overactive imagination of a boy who'd suffered too much trauma, but I noticed he started carrying his rifle into the mine, and he insisted we work in pairs whenever we ventured beyond the familiar tunnels. The other miners began to whisper about strange sounds echoing from the deeper shafts, voices calling out in languages none of them recognized, and the rhythmic tapping of pickaxes coming from sections that had supposedly been abandoned years earlier. But Thomas seemed to find comfort in these mysterious sounds, as if they were welcoming him home to a world the rest of us couldn't see. The truth about what lay hidden in the Coldbrook mine began to reveal itself during the worst blizzard of that winter, when we were trapped underground for 3 days with dwindling supplies and failing candles. On the second night, as we huddled together for warmth in the main chamber, Thomas suddenly stood and walked toward the eastern tunnel with the confident stride of someone following a familiar path. "Don't," my father called out, but Thomas either didn't hear or chose to ignore him, disappearing into the darkness beyond our flickering light. We found him 20 minutes later in a section of the mine that none of us had explored before, standing before a wall that had been carefully bricked up with stones and mortar, and talking to it as if someone on the other side was answering back. "They're not dead," he said when we approached, his young voice carrying an eerie calm that raised the hair on our necks. "They're just cold, like I was." The wall behind him bore scratches that looked almost like writing, symbols that matched those on the locket he still wore around his neck. When my father held our last candle up to examine the markings more closely, we could see that the mortar between the stones was stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. But what terrified me most wasn't the wall or the stains or even Thomas's strange communion with whatever lay beyond it. It was the sound that came from behind those stones when he pressed his small hand against them. A sound like whispers, like breathing, like dozens of voices welcoming him back to a place where the living and the dead shared the same frozen darkness. As the storm finally broke, and we emerged from our underground prison, I realized that Thomas had crossed some invisible threshold during those 3 days in the darkness, moving from our world into something far more dangerous and unknowable. He no longer seemed content to simply work in the mine. Instead, he spent every free moment down in those tunnels, particularly near the bricked-up wall, carrying on conversations with whatever presence lurked behind those stones. My parents grew increasingly worried, but their attempts to keep him away from the mine only resulted in sleepless nights and desperate escapes that always led him back to those underground depths. "It's like he's being called," my mother said one morning after finding his bed empty for the 3rd time that week. called by something that won't let him rest until he answers. The other families in Coldbrook began to avoid us, crossing themselves when they saw Thomas, and whispering prayers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Even the hardiest miners refused to work the eastern tunnels anymore, claiming that the shadows down there moved wrong and that the air itself felt heavy with the weight of untold secrets. But Thomas thrived in that environment of fear and superstition, growing stronger and more confident with each day, as if the darkness below ground was feeding something in him that the surface world had been starving. The final revelation came on a bitter February morning, exactly 3 years after Thomas had first appeared at our door, when the sound of his voice echoing up from the mine shafts woke our entire settlement before dawn. This time he wasn't alone. Other voices joined his in a chorus that seemed to rise from the very bowels of the earth, singing in harmonies that no human throat should have been able to produce. My father and I rushed to the mine entrance with half the men in Coldbrook, our lanterns casting dancing shadows on the frost-covered timbers as we descended into a darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. We found Thomas standing before the eastern wall, but now the carefully laid stones had been pushed aside, revealing a passage that stretched deeper into the mountain than any tunnel we'd ever carved. "They're coming home," he said without turning to look at us, his voice carrying the same otherworldly resonance as the chorus that had awakened us. Behind him, figures began to emerge from that impossible passage, pale, translucent shapes that might once have been human but had been transformed by years of cold and darkness into something that belonged more to nightmare than to reality. As they gathered around Thomas like long-lost family members welcoming a beloved child, I finally understood the terrible truth. My brother hadn't been saved from death that winter night 3 years ago. He'd been recruited into it, chosen to serve as a bridge between our world and whatever frozen hell had claimed the souls of everyone who'd ever disappeared in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. The morning after Thomas disappeared into that impossible passage with his ghostly companions, I made a discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in our cabin, I found a collection of letters written in his careful script, each one dated and addressed to people whose names I didn't recognize. The paper was expensive, the kind that wealthy families used for important correspondence, and the ink had been mixed with something that made it shimmer strangely in the candlelight. As I read through page after page of his secret writings, my hands trembling with each revelation, I began to understand that Thomas had been living 2 lives during his time with us. One as our adopted brother, and another as someone reaching desperately across an impossible divide to contact the world he'd lost. "My dearest Aunt Victoria," read one letter dated just weeks after his arrival, "I pray this finds you well, and that you have not given up hope of finding me, though I fear I am farther from civilization than any map might show." The letters painted a picture of a boy who had never forgotten his origins, despite our family's loving attempts to help him heal by letting go of his past. But the most disturbing aspect of these hidden communications wasn't their existence. It was the fact that they had all been answered, the responses written in hands that trembled with cold and desperation that seemed to seep through the very paper itself. The responses to Thomas's letters came from addresses that shouldn't have existed, remote, outposts that had been abandoned for decades, trading posts that had burned to the ground, and settlements that lived only in the faded memories of old-timers like Pete Mackenzie. Yet somehow, impossibly, these places had produced detailed replies to my adopted brother's careful inquiries, written by people who claimed to remember him and spoke of events that had occurred long before any of us had found him half frozen at our door. "My precious nephew," wrote someone calling herself Aunt Victoria, "how relieved we are to know you survived the terrible fire at Whitehorse Station, though we grieve deeply for your parents and dear siblings who were not so fortunate." The letter went on to describe a family I had never heard Thomas mention. Parents named Edmund and Constance, sisters called Millicent and Rose, and a life of privilege and education that explained so much about his refined mannerisms and mysterious knowledge. But as I read further, the details became increasingly impossible. Dates that contradicted each other, references to events that had happened in different years and different places, and most disturbing of all, descriptions of people who had supposedly died decades before Thomas was even born. These weren't real letters from real people. They were something far more sinister. Communications from whatever dark force had claimed my brother, and was now using his memories to weave an elaborate fiction designed to pull him deeper into its frozen embrace. As spring arrived and the snow began its reluctant retreat from the mountains, I found myself drawn back to the mine day after day, searching for any trace of Thomas or the ghostly figures that had claimed him. The eastern passage remained open, yawning like a mouth that had swallowed something too large and refused to close again, and strange sounds continued to echo from its depths, sometimes voices singing in languages that predated human settlement in Alaska, sometimes the rhythmic tapping of pickaxes that worked veins of ore no living miner had ever discovered. But it was during one of these solitary vigils that I made perhaps the most chilling discovery of all. Scattered throughout the tunnel system, I found dozens of similar letters, written by different hands and dating back nearly 50 years. Each collection told the same heartbreaking story: a lost person, usually a child, maintaining correspondence with family members who should have been dead, receiving comfort and guidance from voices that spoke from beyond the grave. The letters revealed a pattern of disappearances that stretched back to the earliest days of Alaska's settlement, each victim drawn into the same web of supernatural deception that had ensnared Thomas. Names I recognized from old mining records: children who had vanished during harsh winters, entire families who had simply walked into the wilderness and never returned. All of them had left behind these pathetic attempts to maintain connections with a world that had already forgotten them. But the most terrifying realization came when I found letters in my own handwriting, responses I had never written to questions I had never been asked, promising a reunion that would require me to follow the same dark path that had claimed so many others before me. The truth about the letters' origins became clear during the summer solstice, when the endless daylight revealed details that had been hidden by winter's shadows, and I discovered that the entire Coldbrook settlement sat atop a vast network of tunnels that had been carved not by miners seeking gold, but by something far older and more malevolent. The symbols scratched into the mine walls weren't random marks left by desperate trapped souls. They formed a complex pattern that seemed to pulse and shift when viewed by flickering lamplight, creating the illusion of movement and life where none should exist. Following these symbols deeper into the earth than any of us had ever dared to venture, I found the source of the mysterious correspondence. A vast underground chamber filled with desks and chairs carved from ice, where dozens of translucent figures sat writing letters with quills that dripped something darker than ink. They looked up at me with eyes that held the desperate hunger of souls who had been separated from the warmth of human connection for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Among them, barely recognizable after months in this frozen purgatory, sat Thomas, his young hands moving with mechanical precision as he wrote letter after letter to family members who existed only in the twisted memories of the dead. When he saw me standing in the chamber's entrance, he smiled with the innocent joy I remembered from our life together. But his words chilled me to the bone. "Brother, I'm so glad you've come to join us. We have so many letters to write. And eternity is such a very long time to spend alone." The letters that continued to appear in our abandoned cabin throughout the summer told a story of gradual corruption and loss that broke my heart even as it filled me with dread, documenting Thomas's transformation from a living boy into something that existed between life and death. His handwriting grew more elaborate and ornate with each passing week, but the words themselves became increasingly hollow and repetitive, as if he was forgetting what it meant to have genuine thoughts and emotions of his own. "Dearest family," read one letter dated in July, "I am well and happy in my new home, though I sometimes forget why I was ever sad or lonely before." The responses that accompanied these letters grew more demanding and manipulative, urging me to visit the mine, to bring other children from the settlement, to help expand their frozen community by sharing the joy that Thomas had found in his supernatural correspondence. My parents, devastated by the loss of their adopted son and mystified by the strange letters that continued to appear, began to talk of leaving Coldbrook entirely, abandoning the mine and the memories that had become too painful to bear. But I knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. The letters would follow us wherever we went, carrying their poison of false hope and supernatural manipulation until they had claimed our entire family. The only way to save Thomas, if salvation was even possible, would be to confront the forces that held him prisoner and find a way to break the chains of correspondence that bound him to his frozen purgatory. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold, I made the most difficult decision of my young life. Fueled by letters that had grown increasingly desperate and personal, as if Thomas was somehow fighting against his supernatural captors to send me genuine warnings about the fate that awaited anyone who tried to rescue him. "Do not come for me," read his final letter, written in handwriting that trembled with effort and fear. "The cold here goes deeper than flesh and bone. It freezes the very soul until you forget what warmth ever felt like." But between the lines of this official message, written in a code we had developed during our childhood games, Thomas had hidden a different communication entirely, instructions for finding a way to destroy the underground chamber and free the souls trapped within it, even if it meant losing him forever. The plan was dangerous beyond measure and would require me to venture deeper into the mine than anyone had ever gone, carrying materials that could bring down the entire tunnel system and bury the supernatural correspondence network beneath tons of rock and ice. As I prepared for what might be my final descent into those cursed depths, I understood that the letters had served their ultimate purpose, not to maintain connections between the living and the dead, but to lure more souls into a trap that had been baited with the most powerful force in human experience, the desperate need to believe that love could survive even death itself. But sometimes I realized with growing clarity, the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, even when every letter you receive begs you to hold on just a little longer. 90 years have passed since I made my descent into that frozen hell beneath Coldbrook, and only now, as I prepare to join Thomas in whatever realm awaits beyond this life, do I fully understand the magnitude of what we unleashed when we brought that mysterious boy into our home. The dynamite I carried into those cursed tunnels did collapse the underground chamber, sealing away the supernatural correspondence network and freeing the trapped souls, including Thomas, from their icy purgatory. But the explosion also scattered fragments of their cursed letters across hundreds of miles of Alaskan wilderness. These fragments, preserved by the permafrost and carrying remnants of the dark magic that had powered the correspondence network, have been surfacing for decades like seeds waiting for the right conditions to bloom into something far more dangerous than their original form. Modern researchers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters have been finding these scattered pieces throughout Alaska's remote regions, drawn by stories of lost mining settlements and abandoned claims that supposedly hold vast fortunes in unclaimed gold. But what they're actually discovering are the building blocks of a supernatural puzzle that was never meant to be reassembled. Pieces of a communication system that could reconnect the world of the living with forces that should have remained buried beneath the ice. Each fragment they uncover and catalog brings us one step closer to rebuilding the network I died trying to destroy. And I fear that Thomas's true identity is the final key needed to unlock powers that will make the original correspondence chamber look like a child's game. The investigation that began 3 years ago with the discovery of my personal effects in a collapsed mine shaft has attracted attention from people whose interests extend far beyond simple historical curiosity, and their persistent digging into Thomas's origins threatens to awaken something that has slept peacefully in the frozen earth for nearly a century. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the lead researcher on what the academic community has dubbed the Coldbrook Mystery, has assembled a team of experts whose combined knowledge spans archaeology, linguistics, paranormal investigation, and something she calls supernatural correspondence analysis, a field of study that shouldn't exist but apparently does. Her preliminary findings, published in journals I could never have imagined during my simple mining camp childhood, suggest that Thomas wasn't just the survivor of a tragic fire or the victim of a supernatural kidnapping, but something far more significant. The last living descendant of a bloodline that had been specifically bred and trained to serve as conduits between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The documents they've uncovered paint a picture of secret societies dating back to colonial times, families who deliberately placed their children in remote locations throughout the American frontier, creating a network of psychic relay points that could channel communications across vast distances and even across the boundary between life and death. Thomas wasn't lost when he appeared at our door that winter night. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, fulfilling a destiny that had been planned generations before his birth. The modern investigation has revealed that our simple mining settlement of Coldbrook was never a random location, chosen by prospectors seeking fortune in Alaska's goldfields, but rather a carefully selected site that sat atop what Dr. Hawthorne's team calls a dimensional convergence point, a place where the barriers between different realms of existence are naturally thin and permeable. The mine shafts we carved in search of precious metals had unknowingly followed the paths of much older tunnels, passages that had been excavated by indigenous peoples who understood the supernatural significance of this location and used it for rituals designed to communicate with their ancestors. When European settlers arrived and began their own excavations, they inadvertently tapped into the same mystical energies, but without the cultural knowledge and spiritual protections that had kept the original inhabitants safe from the malevolent forces that lurked in the spaces between worlds. The correspondence network that trapped Thomas and so many others wasn't a new phenomenon. It was an ancient system that had been awakened and corrupted by people who lacked the wisdom to control what they had unleashed. The letters that tormented my family for those terrible years were just the latest manifestation of a supernatural communication system that had been operating in various forms for thousands of years, drawing power from the desperate need of separated souls to maintain connections across impossible distances. Dr. Hawthorne's research has also uncovered evidence that Thomas's disappearance into the underground chamber wasn't the end of his story, but rather a transformation that allowed him to exist simultaneously in multiple realms, serving as a bridge between the world of the living and the various dimensions that intersect at convergence points like Coldbrook. Security footage from remote research stations throughout Alaska has captured glimpses of a figure that matches Thomas's description, still appearing to be a young boy despite the passage of 9 decades, moving through blizzards that would kill any normal human being and appearing at locations where researchers have reported unusual electromagnetic disturbances and temperature anomalies. These sightings always occur in places where fragments of the original correspondence letters have been discovered, suggesting that Thomas continues to serve his role as a supernatural courier, perhaps trying to collect and neutralize the scattered pieces of the network I thought I had destroyed. The implications of this revelation are staggering. If Thomas is still alive in some form, still carrying out his otherworldly mission, then my sacrifice achieved nothing except to scatter the danger across a much wider area. The guilt of this realization weighs on my dying soul like a mountain of ice, but it also gives me hope that perhaps, even now, there might be a way to truly end the cycle of supernatural correspondence that has claimed so many innocent lives over the centuries. The most disturbing discovery made by Dr. Hawthorne's team came when they used ground-penetrating radar to map the full extent of the tunnel system beneath the ruins of Coldbrook, revealing a network of passages that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, connecting dozens of abandoned settlements throughout Alaska and western Canada. Each of these settlements, they learned, had experienced similar patterns of mysterious disappearances, supernatural phenomena, and correspondence with the dead, suggesting that the Coldbrook Chamber was just one node in a vast network that had been operating across the entire North American frontier for more than 2 centuries. The radar scans also detected massive chambers at regular intervals throughout the tunnel system, each one containing what appears to be furniture and equipment similar to what I had observed in that terrible ice-carved room where Thomas had been writing his impossible letters. If these chambers are still active, still populated by the trapped souls of people who had vanished from settlements throughout the region, then the scope of the supernatural correspondence network is far greater than I ever imagined. The research team's preliminary estimates suggest that thousands of people, entire families, trading expeditions, survey teams, and pioneer communities had been absorbed into this network over the decades, their bodies preserved in the permafrost while their souls were forced to serve as eternal scribes in a communication system designed to bridge the gap between life and death. As I lie here in my hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitor the final rhythms of a life that has stretched far beyond its natural span, I can feel Thomas's presence growing stronger with each passing hour, as if my approaching death is somehow calling him back from whatever realm he has inhabited for the past 90 years. The letters have started appearing again, not the crude attempts at communication that tormented my family during those early years, but sophisticated documents written in modern language and bearing knowledge of current events that no isolated spirit should possess. My dear brother reads the most recent letter, delivered to my bedside by a nurse who swears she found it frozen to the window despite the summer heat outside. The time has come for us to finish what we started in those tunnels so long ago, but this time we will do it properly. with the wisdom that comes from decades of understanding what we're truly fighting against. The letter goes on to describe a plan that involves not just destroying the remaining correspondence network, but transforming it into something that could genuinely help souls find peace instead of trapping them in eternal servitude. Thomas, it seems, has spent his 90 years of supernatural existence learning how to master the forces that once controlled him. And now he wants my help in implementing a solution that could free not just the souls trapped in Alaska's frozen chambers, but similar networks that Dr. Hawthorne's research suggests exist in remote locations throughout the world. As I prepare to take my final breath and join my adoptive brother in whatever adventure awaits beyond the veil of death, I find myself filled not with fear, but with anticipation, because sometimes the greatest mysteries can only be solved by those who are brave enough to step into the unknown and write their own ending to a story that has been told in whispers and shadows for far too long. The final revelation came not through Dr. Hawthorne's sophisticated research or the supernatural letters that had haunted my family for decades, but through a simple DNA test performed on a hair sample preserved in Thomas's original leather pouch, the same pouch he had clutched so desperately during those first days in our cabin 90 years ago. The results, delivered to my hospital room on the day I had chosen to stop fighting the inevitable, contained information that reframed everything I thought I knew about my adoptive brother and the forces that had shaped both our lives. Thomas wasn't just the survivor of a wealthy family lost in Alaska's wilderness, nor was he simply the victim of a supernatural correspondence network that preyed on isolated souls. He was the descendant of Sarah Blackwood, the so-called Witch of Salem, whose execution in 1692 had been orchestrated not by religious zealots seeking to purge evil from their community, but by a secret organization that recognized her abilities as a natural conduit between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Blackwood bloodline had been tracked and monitored for over 2 centuries, with each generation producing individuals who possessed increasingly powerful psychic abilities that made them invaluable to those who understood how to harness supernatural communication networks. Thomas's arrival in Alaska hadn't been an accident. It had been the culmination of a plan that spanned generations, designed to place him at the precise dimensional convergence point where his abilities would be amplified beyond anything his ancestors had ever achieved. But the DNA results revealed something even more shocking than Thomas's supernatural heritage. According to the genetic markers preserved in that ancient hair sample, Thomas Blackwood hadn't died in 1933 when he disappeared into the underground correspondence chamber, and he hadn't been transformed into some kind of immortal supernatural entity, as Dr. Hawthorne's team had theorized. Instead, he had somehow found a way to exist simultaneously across multiple timelines, living parallel lives in different versions of reality while maintaining his core identity and memories across all possible outcomes. The evidence suggested that every major disappearance in Alaska's history, from the lost Franklin expedition to the vanishing of entire native villages during the harshest winters, had involved Thomas in some capacity, as if he was moving through time and space to rescue souls who were on the verge of being absorbed into the correspondence network. The hair sample contained DNA fragments from dozens of different time periods, creating a genetic profile that should have been impossible, but clearly documented Thomas's presence at historical events spanning nearly 3 centuries. My adoptive brother wasn't just a victim of supernatural forces, he was their guardian, a protector who had dedicated multiple lifetimes to preventing the correspondence network from claiming innocent souls while slowly building the knowledge and power needed to destroy it completely. Dr. Hawthorne's team made their final breakthrough when they realized that the symbols carved into the Coldbrook mine walls weren't random markings left by trapped souls, but rather a complex mathematical equation that described the precise conditions needed to collapse the dimensional barriers that allowed the correspondence network to operate across multiple realms of existence. Thomas had been using his decades of supernatural captivity to study these barriers from the inside, learning their weaknesses and calculating exactly what kind of intervention would be needed to permanently seal the pathways between life and death. The letters he had sent to my family weren't desperate attempts to maintain connection with the living world. They were coded instructions, teaching us how to prepare for a final assault on the network that would require precise timing and the combined efforts of souls operating from both sides of the dimensional divide. When I descended into those tunnels with my dynamite 90 years ago, I thought I was acting on my own desperate plan to save my brother. But in reality, I was following his carefully orchestrated strategy, playing my part in a complex supernatural operation that had been years in the planning. The explosion that I believed had destroyed the correspondence chamber had actually created the exact conditions Thomas needed to begin his work as a temporal guardian, giving him access to the full network while maintaining enough of his humanity to resist its corrupting influence. The truth about my own role in this cosmic drama became clear when the genetic analysis revealed that my DNA shared impossible similarities with Thomas's, despite the fact that we had been raised as brothers with no blood relation whatsoever. According to the test results, I wasn't just a random mining family's son who had happened to be in the right place when Thomas needed rescue. I was another member of the Blackwood bloodline, separated from Thomas during infancy and placed with a family that would unknowingly raise me at the exact location where I would be needed decades later. The mysterious circumstances of my own adoption, which my parents had always claimed involved distant relatives who died in a mining accident, suddenly took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of a multi-generational plan designed to position psychically gifted individuals at strategic points throughout the supernatural communication network. My lifelong sense that I was somehow different from the other children in Coldbrook, my ability to hear the voices that Thomas claimed were calling from the mine shafts, and my instinctive understanding of the symbols carved into the tunnel walls. All of these traits marked me as another descendant of Sarah Blackwood, bred and trained across centuries to serve as Thomas's partner in whatever final confrontation awaited us beyond the veil of death. The realization that our entire family relationship had been orchestrated by forces beyond our understanding should have filled me with anger or despair, but instead it brought a profound sense of peace, because it meant that every moment of love and connection we had shared was genuine, even if the circumstances that brought us together had been carefully arranged by powers we were only beginning to comprehend. As the monitors around my hospital bed began their final symphony of declining vital signs, I felt Thomas's presence solidify in the room around me. No longer the ghostly whisper that had haunted my dreams for 9 decades, but a fully manifested consciousness radiating the warmth and strength of someone who had finally completed an impossible mission. "Brother," he said, his voice carrying all the love and gratitude that had sustained me through a lifetime of wondering whether I had saved him or failed him in those dark tunnels beneath Coldbrook. "It's time for us to finish what we started. But this time, we won't be working alone." Through the hospital window, I could see figures gathering in the parking lot below, dozens of people who moved with the same ethereal quality as Thomas, all of them bearing the unmistakable features of the Blackwood bloodline, all of them carrying the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes spent fighting against supernatural forces that sought to exploit the desperate love between separated souls. They were the descendants who had been scattered across continents and centuries, finally coming together for a confrontation that would either permanently seal the pathways between life and death, or open them so completely that the boundaries between all possible worlds would dissolve forever. "The choice," Thomas explained as my vision began to fade and my consciousness prepared to join his in whatever realm awaited beyond the final breath, would ultimately depend on whether humanity was ready to accept the responsibility that came with genuine communication between the living and the dead, or whether the correspondence networks would need to be sealed forever to protect both sides from forces too dangerous to control. The last thing I saw before leaving my earthly body behind was Thomas reaching out his hand to help me step into a realm where identity wasn't limited by the constraints of a single timeline or a single life, where the boy who had appeared at our cabin door during that terrible blizzard could finally reveal himself as the guardian angel who had been watching over countless souls for centuries, ensuring that love could survive even the ultimate separation of death itself. As I took his hand and felt my consciousness expand to encompass not just my own memories, but the experiences of every member of the Blackwood bloodline who had ever lived, I understood that the correspondence network hadn't been destroyed by my desperate actions 90 years ago. It had been transformed into something beautiful and healing, a genuine bridge between worlds that allowed souls to find peace and closure without being trapped in eternal servitude to forces they couldn't understand. The identity Thomas had been searching for all those years wasn't written in letters or hidden in genetic codes or buried beneath Alaska's frozen earth. It was carved into the very fabric of love itself, proving that some connections are too powerful to be broken by death, time, or the vast cold spaces between the stars. And now finally, after 90 years of separation and mystery, we could begin the real work of helping other souls discover the same truth. That identity isn't about where you come from or what you've lost, but about who you choose to become when faced with the ultimate test of whether love can survive anything, even the journey into the great unknown that awaits us all at the end of every story worth telling.